Hi, everybody. Welcome to Photocon Hawaii Virtual. Nice to have you join us. It's pretty exciting for us to see so many people coming from different parts of the world. We in Hawaii don't normally have that because we're in a closed environment for the past 3 years. So seeing everybody joining us from different parts of the world is very exciting. Today, we have a really great speaker. His name is Pratik Naik. And Pratik is a multitasker. He is a guy that is a retouch artist, world class. But I also noticed that he is a great photographer. And it's kind of cheating because we should only be good at one thing, but somehow this fella has got ability to do both of them really well. Pratik is brought to us by Phase One and CaptureOne, and I'd like to introduce you to him. So let me bring him in and see how he's doing today. Pratik is in California, I believe. I'm looking for him. Hey, there's a guy. How you doing, pal?
Great, Rick. How are you doing?
Doing really well. Hey, Pratik, remind me before I go on, what's your Instagram handle? I was looking.
Yeah, so I have two of them. One is Solstice Retouch. Solstice just like the sun, and Retouch has retouch. Yeah. And I have a photo page called Shot by Pratik as well. So excellent. You can see both my work there.
Yeah, I was just telling people that I find it kind of annoying that you've got the ability to both of those and master them so well. This is quite stunning. Folks, for those attending, just a couple of things on the right-hand side, you'll see that we have a chat box. We encourage you to let us know where you are. It makes us, Teresa and I, who are working this, very happy to see people coming from all over the world. I mean, we've seen Poland, Jamaica, Japan, England, I haven't seen Siberia yet, but I'm looking. So if you want to do that, and then Pratik likes to be able to have his questions as he goes. So if we see something and we can flag it for him, by all means, stop him, check it out. We really like this to be interactive, and we encourage you to just open up. Let's talk.
Yeah.
And as we say in Hawaii, talk story, you know, Pratik, that's our casual way of saying, it's just easy. So without that, we'll just hand it over to you. Have a good time. And folks, please enjoy yourselves. And we do have 3 more workshops after this. Anybody who's on now can register for those. And again, it's all free. So please enjoy yourself. Thank you so much, Pratik.
Thank you so much, Rick. I really appreciate the good introduction. I wanted to firstly tell everyone, I really appreciate y'all for being here today. I'm actually tuning in from Los Angeles. It's so good to see everyone tuning from different parts of the world. From Trinidad and Tobago, which I love, and Hawaii and Florida and all these different places, and from India. I'm really appreciative of that. Today, I actually want to start, before actually jumping into CaptureOne, to invite my wife, Bella, to join me on a conversation. I wanted to see if she's around at the moment. And there she is. Hello, Bella. How are you doing?
Oh, hello.
Hello. Yeah, perfect. So Bella and I are actually married, and she's a fine art photographer, and speaking tomorrow night, tomorrow afternoon, I should say, tomorrow evening UK time, where she's based at the moment. And we wanted to kind of have a conversation and talk a little bit about how we work together in the retouching perspective. Because in regards to like photography, you can tune into hers tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that's going to be something really special. I've had a chance to check it out, so definitely tune in for that. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to say is, if you guys have any questions about us and our working relationship, I would love to answer them for you, because that's something that we do on a daily basis. Bella is so accomplished in her own right in terms of doing the photography side, the editing, the styling. And when we first started working together, it was maybe, what, 5 years ago now? 6 years ago?
6 years ago. Yeah, it was a while ago. But you taught me so much because you're so detail-orientated in the retouching part of the post-processing experience. Yeah, you actually made me think a lot about the actual capturing, like what I should be looking for when it comes to taking the photo. So,
right.
Yeah.
And in fact, funny enough, we actually met at a conference I was teaching in London, and then she came down, and that's where we first met.
Yeah.
And then we started talking after that for quite a while, and we connected on so many different levels that it just felt really organic. And that's, I think, how our working relationship felt organic too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just so happy about the work that you created, and I was in love with it, and I wanted to be a part of that and see where we could take that. And that made me really feel like I could explore and experiment with photographs, the type of photographs that I normally don't get to do, because fantasy work definitely has a ton of other challenges. You know, what type of challenges do you think people face when they deal with fantasy-related work versus like fashion?
Probably the biggest challenge a lot of people would face is the styling. So
Yep.
in fashion, you have a stylist, and you can reach out to a stylist, and often they have a lot of connections with new designers or established designers, and there's just a lot more of a market for fashion. Whereas I feel like fantasy, especially, is a very niche genre, and I think that's something that I will be covering a lot more in depth when I have my talk tomorrow. So for anybody who's interested in fantasy photography in particular and in that genre and how to create storytelling art, then definitely tune in tomorrow. But fashion is something that I started off with, and I think it's a great place to start off with because it allows you to jump into a lot of different things. So for example, you can jump into beauty, you can jump into portraiture, a lot of things I learned from fashion I was able to apply to weddings. So yeah, I think
that's right.
Because I think it's all about capturing a moment. So the difference with fantasy for me is, I was actually talking to a friend about this the other day, where I feel like I have become a little bit too good at almost like planning a vision, like executing a vision, and I'm not allowing myself to capture the moments that are possibly present and might be being missed because I'm so fixated on bringing something in particular to life. Whereas fashion, I feel like there's a lot more freedom in that.
That's right. And I feel the same way when I'm editing those photos as opposed to, say, like a fashion portrait or any other genre. I get to feel more explorative because there's less confines of realism. And so with post-production, there's always a level of play that happens kind of like different photography genres, where photojournalism is more true to life, of course, versus something that we do, which is completely opposite. And the post-production rules, so to speak, somewhat follow, where photojournalism is something where you have to adhere to reality more, and there's specific confines that you cannot break, especially when you're submitting these images for a prize or any news-related source. However, when it comes to our fantasy-related stuff, we can kind of do whatever we want. And that level of exploration and seeing the two different sides of post-production can not only, create a lot of fun opportunities, but also give you the potential to learn different techniques and facets of post-production, which is why today is so special, because CaptureOne is something that I use for everything, no matter whatever it is that we're trying to shoot. And we use that as a staple for every image that we use. So we're going to go into why we use it, some of the great tools and functions about it, something that I think everyone should know about too. But besides that, I also want to address some of the questions from the audience. And Kigar asked, how has your relationship changed your work and vision and process?
Well, you can start off with that. I'd be interested to hear what you say.
So I think that working with Bella has allowed me to see light in a different way, because when we came into this relationship in the beginning, I had primarily worked on studio photography quite a lot less than actually natural light shots. And I was really inspired to know that Bella at the time was primarily using a lot of natural light. And I was shocked because I didn't know the possibilities of natural light
100% natural light.
Yeah. And I thought she had manipulated studio light or had done something really complicated with her setups. And I was like, I just don't understand. And when I saw the raw files, I was like, oh, okay. And I was started to encourage her to speak more about her process, which is why she's here today as well, and tomorrow with her course. And that has changed my vision and my thinking process, that I don't need to be limited by my lighting equipment and my setups. I still have much more to go in terms of learning about it and pushing these files in a way that, can live up to its potential. And then I started getting less scared of using lights in all kinds of varieties, whether it's overcast, whether it's dimly lit, whether it's speckle light. I didn't feel those limitations anymore prior to that.
That's so interesting.
What about you?
Say that, because actually I would say the same for myself, where you influenced my lighting approach, because I was 100% natural light when we first met, because I was very nervous of going into a studio and using strobes and continuous lighting, and I just didn't understand it, so I didn't even try. And you were the one who really encouraged me to just play and see what was possible. And actually, a lot of the times I would let you lead with the lighting and allow you to just sort of do your thing. And I would just observe you and learn by observing you, because I never had the opportunity to ever learn from like watching another photographer on set. Everything I know, I've learned through trial and error. So I would say that I've definitely learned lighting from you. But one of the key things I think I've learned from you is just what I said earlier, which is just noticing details. I'm a very detail-orientated person when it comes to editing, and for anybody who does tune in tomorrow, you'll see exactly what I mean. I really, really am very conscious about what is in a frame and what I choose to keep in and out of a photo. Yeah. That has actually been enhanced more after I met you. because I'd send you files to have a look at, and Pratik would be like, oh, when I took this away, or I took that, or I subdued this, because you had a lot more experience with just a lot of other people's files, so you notice distractions more in an image, and then that just changed the game for me. I was like, just thinking, wow, what is distracting me from the story that I want this picture to tell? And it could literally just be like a branch here, or a bit of light there, or some part of an image is a little bit brighter than the other part, and I wouldn't have noticed. And so by noticing these distractions, I was able to create work that I was really proud of, because they sort of had that kind of sort of cohesiveness to them, and that level of thought that just ties it all together as a body of work that we want to an artist.
That's really fascinating, because when I approached my work as a retoucher and working with multiple photographers, at the time I didn't realize what a opportunity it was to be able to work on the raw files from different kinds of creatives. And that opened my eyes as a photographer as well, to see that, you know, many people that shoot very similar lighting styles can also walk away with tremendously different results, which is why I love doing things like this, because it also shows people that there are really no secrets when it comes to photography. We always share what we know, because people take that and actually create something completely different, which then in return can inspire you. So it is just a wheel of creativity that you shouldn't really hold back for any, you know, particular reason. And I really want, you know, people to see also Bella's session tomorrow, because we talked a little bit about what she's going to be doing in terms of, you know, her thought process. And that's something that typically doesn't always come through when you see a photographer's work, because there's so many decisions that happen in the culling stage and everything before the actual editing begins. And I think, you know, if you have the opportunity, work with a retoucher as well, and collaborate with more creatives, because as Bella knows, you know, you're only able to then learn from that experience, see the things that they're seeing on your files, and you're going to see a whole completely new potential of what's possible, regardless of what you shoot. Even if it's street photography, you know, asking a retoucher to process raw files in their own vision would be very curious, and it enables you to actually learn a lot as well.
This is so important. I'm so glad you brought it up as well, because I never used to collaborate with other photographers, and actually I know plenty of photographers who don't do that because of a variety of reasons, and one of which is because people get very nervous about sharing their secrets or sharing their approaches, because perhaps the market isn't that big and they don't want to feed a competition. I don't know. However, if you ever do get the opportunity, wherever you travel in the world, even if in your own neighborhood as well, just reach out to local creatives and test and collaborate with them, and just throw it out there, and don't be scared to receive a no, because that's fine. But you might be quite surprised at how many people say yes. And if anything, not only will you learn something, you will make a connection. And that connection is so important. Like, just being connected, the more people you know, I feel, allows for a lot more opportunities to sort of present themselves.
Yes.
And I've always felt that everything that's good that's come in my life in terms of creating interesting work is because I've just reached out to people that I found interesting.
Yes, it's so true. When I usually travel to different places, one thing that stems into expanding your career specifically is the opportunity to network and reaching out to creatives, as Bella said. And one thing that has done for me is giving me opportunities that I would have never expected. For example, today has been an accumulation of little steps of that effort being displayed, where working with CaptureOne in phase 1, for example, have only happened because I've put myself out there and reached out to many people. And it wasn't through a cold email where I messaged CaptureOne and said, hey, I want to work with you. It was indirectly where I used CaptureOne regularly, and I talked about how passionate I was about it. And I reached out to different creatives whenever I traveled, and seemingly enough, they all seemed to use a program or something similar. And when I did workshops on it, eventually people start noticing these things. So the energy that you put out there in your creative pursuits, whether it's post-processing or photography, does always come back to you, and people are watching regardless of whether they sometimes say things or not. And we have to remember that, because there's a lot of silent voices out there, but there's a lot of positive voices, and we often focus on the negative ones. But that's the thing, is even though there's a small number of them, of the negative ones, we forget the silent ones and the overwhelmingly positive ones. So that, I think, that ethos, I think, has been the biggest thing to pushing our careers as well to get to where we wanted to be.
Do you ever save the positive messages or comments that you received that particularly struck a chord with you?
I have not. However, I do recall times where people have come up to me and said, thank you so much for liking this one comment that I had left you, or something like that, where for me, it wasn't an action that I would remember years down the line, but because of this one gesture, someone decided that they would like to pursue retouching further, and it inspired them to do so, just to see how people in the industry are. And like PhotoCon Hawaii is so cool, where everybody involved has been such a really positive and nice person that the energy is kind of vibrant. I really feel it as I'm even talking to you today.
Yeah, I feel like if you're somebody who gets affected by negative comments, even if they are few and far between, but they are something that do impact you, then definitely make a note, like a conscious note, to save really good positive comments. So if you ever receive a negative comment, just go to your positive comment folder, or wherever you've saved anything good that anyone's ever said, and then just reaffirm yourself that actually you're pretty badass. Like, you're good, you're solid. The negativity is not about you, it's about the other person projecting onto you.
That's true.
Yes.
That's a very good point.
Because I'm somebody who forgets very quickly good things and just focuses on like, oh no, I'm like, not a good photographer, blah, 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 blah. But then I realize that, oh, actually, I don't know that person. It doesn't matter.
Speaking of really good things, we are going to answer one more question. And so I would like to answer Keegar's question. And let me just be sure we... Karen asked before if we could share some photography tips, which I'm going to do in the post-processing section. So stay tuned. I'm going to do some Photoshop as well. But Keegar asks, let's see here. I'm going to answer live. And he says, Pratik and Bella, have you switched roles for fun behind the camera and retouching? I'm going to let you answer that one.
Well, Pratik won't let me retouch because I'm so bad at it. I mean, no, wait, listen. You're good at skin retouching. I'm good at composition and color toning. So we stick compositing. Yeah, so I'm good at compositing and color toning. So I stick to my strengths. And whenever I do try skin retouching, I'm much better at it now. Admittedly, I'm a lot better at it now than I was before. But for bigger client jobs, he will not let me do the skin retouching.
So, but tell me though, it's curious that you say that, because naturally you weren't inclined to be somebody who enjoyed skin retouching as much, right, in the beginning?
Not at all, not even a little bit.
but you still made progress.
That's because I had to send you the files, so you were very good motivation.
But it shows you that regardless, what I'm trying to say is regardless of the experience level,
True.
you were able to then push forward and learn a lot, even though you didn't like it, even though you knew you weren't the best at it, but you still were able to do it.
It's true. So with that being said, I suppose if I can do it, anybody else can do it. You guys are going to learn a lot in a moment when he jumps into his programs. Yeah, if I can do it, anybody can do it. Honestly, skin retouching, dodging and burning is an art.
It's fun, you guys. I want to hear in the comments, like, who enjoys retouching? Like, who enjoys the post-production side? Because I feel like we're the underdog sometimes, you know?
That is so good. True. Let us know in the comments who actually enjoys retouching.
Sierra says, I love her accent.
Thank you.
Roy loves it. It's me, Roy, and Leia.
There's two types of people in the world.
Yes.
People who like retouching and people who want to be far away from the computer. I'm one of those people.
I'm weird. Like, I enjoy the photography side and the post-production side. So I'm just like constantly either holding something digital or like working with something digital.
Yeah.
I need another art form.
You're connected to the photography matrix. We've decided.
Yeah, we're all in the matrix together. Aloha, right?
It's so true. It's so interesting how many people love retouching. Wow.
Good. Yes. Joseph says, what type of softwares do we use? Now we can transition into the post-production. We got a couple more minutes. What we're going to do is for 5 more minutes, we're going to answer these additional questions. And they're really good, so I don't want to avoid them. And Joseph says, what softwares do we use? And I would say collectively, we both use CaptureOne and Photoshop together. And Photoshop for the post-processing side in terms of the compositing and the color grading primarily. And then for the processing the raw files, we will use CaptureOne for that, which is how we got into this conversation.
So prior to CaptureOne, I used to only process in Photoshop itself, Adobe Raw, or Lightroom. And then Pratik actually introduced me to CaptureOne years ago. And honestly, it changed the game. So for anybody who hasn't actually tried CaptureOne yet, then I don't know if you have or haven't. You should definitely let us know in the comments if you haven't tried it and if you're nervous about it. But I opened up a file in CaptureOne and opened up a file in Adobe Raw, and the color difference and just the processing difference of how those programs process raw files just made me immediately switch to CaptureOne. And I think for me it's because it's color based. Like a lot of my passion is in color toning. And so it just made sense. You can just do so much more in CaptureOne and then bring it to Photoshop to then build up more on.
Yeah, and we have so many different users at the moment in our comments. And it's so fascinating to me because obviously CaptureOne isn't used as widely as Adobe products, of course, we know that. And they offer a free trial for anybody who wants to just check it out. And then if they don't want to use it, that's fine. And their YouTube, if you're looking for free information as well about it, the YouTube page for CaptureOne actually has a phenomenal catalog of short videos that get you into it. And I'm going to show you a way that you can organize your workspace to match Lightroom too, so that people can be more familiar with the whole process. But the other thing that I want to mention is that, of course, whatever you have, use whatever you have, because it's not always about the gear and the tools. It's about exploring whatever you have at the moment. I even now use like hot lights and lamps as part of my main lights when I do photography. And so you could do so many great things with what you're looking for. But then when you feel like, you know what, you might want to explore other avenues and see the different potentials of what you might be missing, keep an open mind to the different tools that are available to push those files even further. And that's kind of the takeaway that I wanted to give you all today, is regardless of your experience level, I'm going to show you these things, and whether or not you like it is totally up to you, and you don't have to feel pressured into taking it. But I think you're going to find it very enjoyable and interesting seeing what's possible. Perfect. So I think I'm going to leave you with any last comments that you might have, Bella.
Okay.
And then we will get started.
Yeah, I think I'm really happy that I could jump on here for a bit and have a little conversation before you get stuck in. Thank you everybody for sending in your questions. It was really nice to chat with you. And I will see you guys tomorrow. I mean, I'll still linger a lot in the comments a little bit. I'm going to watch you. I'm judging you. I'm not judging you.
She's like, I'm not going to watch you anymore. I've seen you enough. That's good.
But I will be here tomorrow, and you'll be here tomorrow with me too. So Pratik is going to jump on mine as well for a spell, I hope.
Yeah. I will be there, and I will be excited to see what you have.
Okay, great. Okay, have fun,
right.
Enjoy, get stuck in.
See you soon, Bella. Have fun.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you all so much. Now you're here stuck with me. Bella can't interrupt me and stop my little dad jokes from happening, so that's going to be fun. We are going to jump straight into CaptureOne really quick. Let me just scroll up to see if I can answer any questions or see your comments. People have been saying in the chat, if you've been following along, if you don't know, make sure you post your questions in the chat. And I'm going to share my screen right now. Jump into CaptureOne. I won't be able to see your comments as they pop up, but I will be notified when they do come for anything topical. So I'm going to go share my screen right now. I'll keep my webcam on so I can talk to you too. And we'll go ahead and share my screen. And now we will jump into CaptureOne. So hopefully you should all be seeing this current window at the moment. Don't be alarmed by anything at the moment. I'm going to zoom out here really quickly and show you something interesting. I have made a couple of small adjustments on this photograph. I'm just going to quickly reset this, and I'll explain all this in just a moment. So the reset function, of course, resets all your settings and tools. But before we get into anything, this interface here, if you're completely new to it and are coming from Lightroom, there is a way to set it up that makes it look completely like Lightroom as well. And the access to that is under Window, Workspace, and you can see different kinds of options here. And I'm going to use Migration. And what Migration does is, as you notice, it actually puts everything at the bottom like a film strip, like Lightroom does, and it keeps all your adjustments on the right-hand side like Lightroom. But the beauty of CaptureOne specifically, and what I like about it, is I can change different workspaces. I can change it to like default, which is the standard workspace that CaptureOne typically comes with. And I like keeping my little thumbnails here on the right-hand side, just because I can take more real estate for my vertical window here, and it doesn't actually cut off at the bottom like a film strip does. And I really like that a lot. And I can also tweak and adjust the size of my window, kind of like my little explorer here. And I can also change the width of my thumbnails. So in case I want a full little catalog here showing everything in my catalog or session, I could do that. Or if I decide to increase my thumbnails and make selections a little bit faster, I could do that too. That's kind of a really cool tip that I want to mention off the bat, just because people tend to come from other softwares and they want to make it a little bit more easier to use and more applicable when they see the interface. Now, of course, getting images into CaptureOne is something that you can do in many ways. It has an import function here at the top left, and if you've never used it before, they'll have an import image right in the middle where nothing is. And what happens is, whenever you click on import, you can decide and choose a specific file, folder, location, what have you, and you can decide to import images from there. Now, one thing that I do want to mention at the moment is CaptureOne has catalogs just like Lightroom, and it has something called sessions. And sessions are kind of like mini catalogs where, let's say you're trying to do a catalog for just one shoot. Well, I would call it a session because I had a session with that person. And what I like about sessions is that it saves the session in its specific folder, and you can put all your images within that folder. And what I like about that specifically is if you then move that one folder of that one shoot to another location, CaptureOne's not going to be confused. You'd load that session file, and then boom, all your images pop up with all your saved settings and everything like that. So sessions are really fun to use, and I think I like using them because I make a session for every single shoot that I do. And so that's typically how I use the program. But regardless if you use sessions or catalogs, they both look identical when they're within CaptureOne. Okay, keep that in mind. The other really great thing that I like to use sessions for is sometimes if I put a session here, and you can see on the left-hand side, or maybe you might not be able to see, but this session is called tests. And I like using a kind of like an empty session or like an empty catalog because I'm able to use CaptureOne like a window browser. And let me tell you what I'm talking about here. So for instance, you know, whenever you go into your Finder window like this, and you can see your different folders here, like your documents, your downloads, etc. Well, CaptureOne actually has a very similar interface, where over here on your library tab, you will see a library tab similar to Lightroom, where you can star, you can rate, and color tag. Well, on the right here, there's something called system folders. Well, system folders is really handy because if you're using CaptureOne to quickly browse through, let's say, different folders, or you want to see what's in a particular folder, you can simply just click on the folder in the location that it would normally be on your computer. So for instance, I have a hard drive here called Mobile One, which is the hard drive that I use when I travel. And in that folder, I have a subfolder called Photo Shoots, which is the photo shoots that I've been doing regularly. Perhaps I really want to see what the raw files are in this recent folder called 2020 Coco and Jackson, and there are our two cats. So if I click on it and say click on capture, you'll see all the cat photos that I've captured. And I didn't have to make a new session for it or anything like that, or a new catalog. I could just use it as a browser. And sometimes if I want to quickly access a raw file, like export it really quickly, or make some quick adjustments and export it as a JPEG, I might use a session like this. And this is a fun way to use CaptureOne as well, instead of your typical window browser. But you know, that's not here or there. You can see like family photos and all of that. Another really cool part about CaptureOne is just like Lightroom, you can have session favorites. So perhaps, you know what, I want to save this folder here as a session favorite. You can save them accordingly under session favorites as well. So you're able to, you know, do a bunch of different things, and we can drag it here if you want to, etc. You can also say add session favorite, and it would, you know, look for whatever it is that you want to add to your favorites. So that's kind of really cool. As you've noticed, I already had these little favorites starred here, and this is my session here called Tiger Kaufman, who is a fantastic model here in LA. I love shooting with her, and we are going to be using one of these files today for our post-processing. Now, before I go into that, one thing I want to mention is that Lightroom and CaptureOne does have actually quite similar tools. There's some tools that CaptureOne has that Lightroom doesn't have that I want to talk about. And I'm primarily going to be using today to explain how I look at an image, what I want to adjust with that image, and how we can go about that using the tools. So it's more of a familiar use case situation. Now, also, the thing about CaptureOne is if I decide that I want to star or rate anything, you're able to do so with the filters here, or you can easily star them underneath here if I wanted them to, or underneath the thumbnails too. It also has different color tags that you can use. For example, if I want to change this to red, I can do so. I'll make that my main select. And then I can filter by color tag, like red, and also 5 stars. And then now suddenly anything that's red and 5 stars is then showed on the interface. So it's pretty straightforward there. Now, aside from the rating system and all of that, that pretty much consists of what I wanted to talk about in this little tab here on the left, which I think I'm just going to call this my library tab, which is exactly what it's called. As you hover over these icons here, you'll notice what the tabs are called, and they have their respective tools within that area. So library tab has your library, of course, your system folders, your ratings, your filters, etc., and all these fun little keywords and things like that. Next is going to be the camera tab. Now, the camera tab is specifically used for tethering. So if you ever tethering on location and start a new session for your shoot, then you plug in your camera and boom, you'll have your settings here. And a lot of the time, you can also control your camera settings through this specific dialog. So then you're able to actually decide what shutter speed you want, what f-stop you want, etc. And then, of course, there's other things that you can do here, which is not so important right now, but they are in this tab. Next, we have things like lens correction, which I pretty much leave as standard because it automatically recognizes my lens, which is the 50-1.2, and it has chromatic aberration and distorted areas checked. And of course, it has crop options, rotation, etc., and everything related to fine-tuning adjustments. So that's pretty straightforward, and it's under the lens dropdown. The next one we're going to head on to is going to be this one here. It's the 3 little rings in the corner, and that's going to be my favorite, and that is the color tab. Now, these tabs, even though they're called their specific name, you can put whatever you want in them. So for instance, in this color tab here, I see layers, which I'm going to get into in a second. I see base characteristics, white balance. So it shows you my profile for the individual cameras, which is something that is relatively specific to CaptureOne, because what happens is with each camera and lens, you get a different profile because every camera and lens actually shows colors a little bit differently, right? So what needs to happen is that these cameras and lenses need to be tested, and a profile has to be created in order for the program to read the files as nice as possible. And I say nice as possible because the colors look very pleasing out of the box. It's almost like calibrating your screen, except you don't have to calibrate anything. It comes with these profiles there. And the best part about this is if you look at my screen and I click on ICC profile, if you can't read it, I'm just going to tell you it's called ICC profile. You can say show all. And when I click on show all, which happens now when I click on it, you'll see all the camera systems, which are the main ones, and you will see all the main cameras. So if you have a specific Canon camera, it will have a profile dedicated to that. And if you notice the thumbnail, it changes ever so slightly. Well, these two have a big difference. Just because, again, the camera profiles dictate what camera you use. And then in the lens section, you will see the lens correction. You'll see the profile there too. So they have their individual characteristics that are kind of, accomplished and spoken for, I should say. Next, over here, we have something that is less utilized, and it's called curve. It's not the curves that you're used to in Photoshop, but it's the curve that happens to the camera profile. So for instance, and the best example is to show you visually, the curve itself is always set to auto by default. However, if you click on it, there's other options. One is film extra shadows. So you can see here that opened up the shadows really nicely. And let me hover over that again from auto to extra shadow. So you can see here that actually it makes quite a big of a difference. Then you have high contrast if you want the other way. And then you have a linear response, which kind of really flattens out the tonal curve of the image. So if you have bright highlights and really dark shadows, if you put linear response, it does a pretty good job of flattening those highlights and bringing them down so that you have more latitude when you're adjusting your raw file. I personally always leave that to I. Now, before I continue, let me go ahead and reset this file as well. And you can see here that it's actually quite, what's the word? Underexposed. And let me just make sure it's not my screen, but it is a little bit underexposed. So we're going to start there. Of course, as I mentioned, we have the color tab here, and it has white balance, color editor, etc. And I will get to that. And these other options. Let's fast forward. Next, we have the exposure tab. So this is where light meets color. In the exposure tab, you have white balance, you have exposure, dynamic range, and all these things are not specifically related to color. If you want to make your workflow easier, you can also add some color options to this tab. And the way to do that is if you right-click on any of these areas here, and you say Add Tool, you can add any tool in CaptureOne in any order that you're looking for. So say that you would like, let's go and say color balance. Let's add the color balance here. And then it will add to the bottom color balance. And you can move that in any place that you want. You can even move that over the interface like this if you're color grading an image. And I think this is so powerful because sometimes I really want to work with nuances with like a color balance wheel, and I can make them really large, and every movement that I do is actually going to be quite nice. So for me, I think that was a really fun way to work in a space like that. So I'm going to put that back because it doesn't need to be that large and in your face at the moment. If I want to bring it back there, I can. If I want to close it out, I can just say remove tool. It will come back anytime you want. So for me, that's a really handy function of organizing the space. And of course, you can also hide some of these as well. Perhaps you don't want to see some things. You can also go to, say, View, and you can say, let's uncheck the tools. So if I uncheck the tools, I only see my selection and my preview. This might be very good for actually making selects in this view, and I can turn that back on by going to View and Tools, of course. So that's just a really quick overview of the program. I hope that made a lot of sense. There's tons of other options, but again, check out the YouTube page. It's very, very handy. There's also the before and after little function. This is relatively new, and you can see a before and after as you so choose to. You can see a full view, or you can simply use a split slider screen here too. So either way works fantastic. I really love that addition. For me, that's so handy. Now let's actually have some fun here. CaptureOne, as I mentioned, is very versatile, and Bella touched on this slightly, where the primary difference for me is when you open this file up in other raw processors, they will look completely different, because what happens is the raw processor decides what the file should actually look like. So perhaps, if you say use 3 different raw processors, they will all look completely different. And that isn't because that's how your camera sees it. It is because the camera is just capturing raw information, which has actually no opinion. Think of it like a neutral party. It has no opinion about how it should specifically look. But what happens is the raw processor interprets that and says, you know what? The red should look this red, and the green should look like this, and the saturation value should be a little bit like this. And that's why these profiles come in so handy, is where when they test the camera and the light, I'm sorry, not the light, they test the camera and the lens, and they make a profile, someone and the lab in Denmark, the color professor, is actually testing different subjects with each camera and saying, you know what? Let's use these charts here and see how accurate the red is, and they're fine-tuning and doing all the nerdy stuff and then making it look pretty good out of the box. And that's kind of what the whole range of this program is about. And so because of that, even though I might sometimes not do anything at all with the raw file, I might import it, and sometimes it honestly looks really good as is. I might just export that and then do what I want, because I like a good starting base. And the same thing goes for different cameras. If you have a camera that, like Fujifilm, for example, has a very different characteristic when it comes to colors. Or if you use Canon, there's a different characteristic as well. And so that's kind of what it reminds me of. So even though, raw files are raw files and you can adjust them to how you want to, a starting base is really critical to your vision. And everyone has a different vision, which is why I encourage you to try different things. And now continuing with that, this particular image, I shot this last year, actually here in LA. And what I really loved about this scene is I actually use a really small amount of fill light. I use a really big octabox. And for the reason, specifically because I really wanted a nice fill without a ton of fall off. I wanted the light to kind of spread evenly across the scene, which is why I like softboxes, not so much of the size itself, but of the way it kind of spreads. And it allowed me to get the shadows filled in a little bit, just enough where it can maintain the contrast, but still, show a little bit more in the skin. Maybe if I was doing it again or tethering, I might have done a little bit more. But, nowadays the dynamic range in most cameras are pretty good, so I don't mind that at all. What I am going to do, though, on that note, is increase the shadows a little bit further. And there's a couple of ways that I really like doing that. Number one is we are going to come here on the exposure tab, and let's play around. Let's actually play around here. I haven't done this in a while, so you're going to go on a little journey with me as I'm working. But let's say I go and enhance the exposure here. sometimes what I will do normally is I am going to just zoom in here with my scroll wheel, and I'll use my space bar to drag around the image. And when I increase my exposure, I like to see how much detail is still available in those shadows. And as you notice, it's actually quite a lot. So I'm not struggling to get any details here. Even within the highlights, if I go back to our curve here, making sure that's set to auto, because I don't want linear response just yet, because it's I intentionally lit this accordingly. I also want to increase my exposure and decrease my exposure to make sure that no highlights are kind of blown out, because I think that's very important. It's not necessarily that blown highlights are bad, but based on your intention, the look you're going for, it changes. So exposure looks pretty good in that respect, but I do want to increase my shadow detail. So how can we do that? Well, naturally, we have a high dynamic range slider, which we could also do here. And you can see it does a really good job. One thing that I have noticed about CaptureOne is even though the tools look the same, they actually operate very differently. If you did the same thing where you're increasing the shadow specifically, what you'll notice is that the way it decides what is a shadow and what is a midtone and how much to increase midtones and shadows are very different. So for instance, let's say that it only increased the shadows. What would happen is there would be no increase in the midtones and the highlights, which could look bad. But so the algorithms and the programming is done where when you increase the shadows, it also tapers off really nicely into the midtone, so you have a really nice transition. But let's say that you might not even like the way that the program enhances that, because you have no control over where the information is going to be lifted in the midtones or the highlights, but you want more control over the exposure of your image. And that's where I think layers comes into play and the Luma range function comes into play. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Over here at the top of every tab, I would say, mostly, yeah, pretty much, whether in your color tab or your exposure tab, you have something called layers. One thing to note is that even though they're all called layers, they are all pretty much the same. So if I add a layer on this tab, it will reflect on that tab. So no matter what tab you're in, that'll be the same thing, okay? They're not like two different sets of layers or anything like that. It's only there because if you're trying to change over to another tab, you can continue making adjustments on your layer panel. So it's kind of cool, it mirrors each other, and I think that's nice. So what I will do here first is the purpose that I want going forward is I'm gonna add a layer for exposure specifically because I wanna increase the exposure in the shadows in a way that I can kind of really control it. So I'm going to come over here to the bottom left on your layers tab. I'm going to click and hold the plus sign, and I'm going to say new filled adjustment layer. Now, here's the thing. There's two. One says empty and one says filled. What's the difference? Well, let's say that you are in Lightroom and you have the adjustment brush. Well, what happens with the adjustment brush is you have to first input your settings and then you start brushing and then it shows you all the changes, right? But what happens if I want to just add a layer, but I want to make global adjustments where I increase the exposure tab and I want it to show across the entire image? Well, new filled layer is exactly for that. So let me just show you physically so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Let's say I hit new filled layer here and I increase my exposure. You can see that it increased everything. So what's basically happening is if you think about this in Photoshop terms, it's actually with a white mask. Everything is being visible. But the other option, let me just go and delete this for a second. I'm gonna hit the minus key, making sure that the layer is selected. If I do that again and then hit new empty adjustment layer, what it means is this layer has a black mask, if you want to think of it that way, where if I increase my settings now, nothing happens. Well, why would you do that? Well, the reason is if I have nothing being visible at the moment, it means it's waiting for me to actually apply these settings in very local areas. So again, it's telling me, pick your adjustment brush and start brushing. So if I go up here and I click on my brush icon, it's going to actually load the brush tool. And I can use my bracket keys to increase or decrease my brush size. Or I can click on the setting option here and change my size, and I can change my hardness, I can change my opacity. typically I will always leave it at a 0% hardness for the most part, and my flow will come down to maybe around 2 or 3%, something really gradual, you know? And then what happens is, as I start brushing here, it's going to increase the exposure in the different parts of the image. If I increase my flow even further, you're going to see it happen pretty quickly, I would say. So there you go. You can see that increases. My opacity always will stay at 100 too. I'm sorry, my opacity is 100. My flow is going to increase now. So if I want to show you really quickly how it comes up, you'll see over here now that my exposure setting is there. It's showing up. So that's kind of how that works. Again, a new empty adjustment layer will be a black mask layer waiting for you to brush. So if you're trying to do quick brush strokes, you want to do a new empty adjustment layer. However, the reason why I like this new filled layer is because I like to see how much exposure is going to be brought up in these specific areas, and then I will change it over to a black mask really quickly and then start brushing it in. So this is how it works. I'm going to increase my exposure like this to the point where I'm like, you know what, I think I kind of like how much that's coming up here on my hair area and my shadows and my eyes. I can see that coming up really nicely. And then what I will do is I'm going to right click on my adjustment layer and say invert mask. And now everything is hidden. And now I can start brushing like normal and just bring up the areas that I'm looking for. So for instance, I can click on my settings, go back to my opacity, making sure that's where it is. My flow, I'm going to bring down to around 2 or 3%. So you can see here, my hardness is 0, opacity is at 100, because I just want to continue brushing till it gets to 100. And my flow is specifically about how fast my brush is going to show me the exposure coming up. So when I have a low flow, every time I brush is going to be very gradual, kind of like airbrushing. So if you want to know the settings for like really gradual strokes, this would be the best way. 100% opacity, 2 or 3% flow, and it does a really fantastic job. So now what I will go ahead and do here is I'm just going to start brushing, bringing up my exposure a little bit in the shadows. And so now I can paint in exposure, so to speak, really gradually, like that. And if it's too much, the best part is I have opacity control on my layer. So I'm like, no, that's too much. Or I could just use my eraser brush tool, do the same thing, change over my settings and my flow, there we go, like that. Let's increase that. And I can bring that back if it's too much. So it gives me multiple different options here, which I think is fantastic. Another thing to note is that you can also use creative controls. So for instance, perhaps you want to increase or decrease the exposure of your shadows or your midtones or highlights and really control it. Here's how it's done. First, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing and say new filled adjustment layer. Now, let me go ahead and delete my first layer that I did because I'm going to be doing that again, but another method. I'm going to click on it, and then I'm going to increase my exposure like this. But perhaps I don't want the exposure to affect my highlights or my midtones and only the shadows. Here's another way to do it. Once I've done that, once I have my exposure setting already placed, I'm going to click on this Loom Arrange function in your layers. Once I have that selected, what you'll notice, it has this little chart here that pops up with these little arrows and buttons and all this kind of fun stuff. What this is basically telling me is that the left point here is my deepest shadows, the right point here is my deepest highlights. Anything in the middle here that's white means it's activated. So for instance, if I take this top part here and move it inwards, you'll notice that now only the highlights are being pushed up further. And the reason is simple. On the right side here, again, we have our brightest highlights. And then here in the middle is closest to like our midtones. So what it's saying is that everything on the left of that is off. You're turning parts of the layer completely off. And only the right side where the highlights and midtones are, where this white area is on. So you can decide exactly where this layer is going to work. So for instance, now that I have that done, if I want to have a better transition, or let's say, let's focus on the shadows here. I'm going to move this whole thing to the left here like that. And I'm going to turn off my highlights. But clearly that looks horrible, right? That does not look good. Now the shadows are brighter than the heights. It's a mess. So here's what we're going to do. Number one, we're going to reduce, we're going to first change the actual area that's being affected. So for instance, I actually want a better transition. So what we're going to do at the bottom here, there's this little second point that jets off from the top. This is the fade option. So I can fade the transition from where it ends and where it begins. So I can go like this, and you can see it fades really nicely. Now the fading is really beautiful, the blending is beautiful, but the amount of exposure is completely off. Now everything looks flat and not great. So I'm going to hit apply. And then I'm going to adjust my exposure. So now you can see the gradation is so beautiful, and I can easily adjust my shadow exposure just like that. And I think that works even better than the built-in tool. So I'm pretty happy about that. I'm so glad that worked. I didn't have to mask and manually paint anything, and it did a better job than I would have done. Another cool creative option for you is you can also use options like white balance with your adjustment layer, which is really fantastic. And another cool thing that you can do is if I do the same thing like that, a new filled adjustment layer, I adjust my white balance. Let's say I want to warm highlights, okay, even warmer. Then I can click on Luma Range and do the same thing, but this time I will move it all the way to the right. I will push this top part here flat against the wall so it starts at the brightest highlight, and then as it transitions into your midtones, it's going to nicely taper off, and you can totally change the implication of how warm or cool your highlights are. So you can change your white balance specifically for the areas that you're trying to go for. This is even better than color grading in Photoshop because you have raw data. Keep in mind, raw data is for exposure, it's for anything. So it's not only if you have your highlights and shadows there, but if you want to change your white balance, it's a very realistic transition. So you're able to do all kinds of creative things. And keep in mind, you can add more adjustment layers for your midtones, your shadows. You can do an adjustment layer, and on this one, for your highlights that I've already tweaked, for the warmth, I can increase, let's say something else like contrast. I can increase the contrast of my highlights and the warmth. And I can change the entire feel of this image just like that. So let me take a quick before and after look. You can see here what a difference we've already made in such a short amount of time. And of course, everybody has a different eye and what they want to go for. I like to personally work off of emotion. I don't believe in a specific white balance. I don't believe in a specific way that I should really be kind of processing a photograph. It does come down to what I see at the moment and visually talking it out. For me in this image, I just loved to see a little bit more detail in the shadows. I love to see more warmth in the highlights. So I kind of gravitated towards that naturally going there. And warm tones are nice because now I've noticed she's wearing a red shirt. She has some nice green tones in the scene. It kind of really pairs up together, and everyone has their different preferences. So that's kind of a really cool thing about that. And again, you can mask as well. Even though I've already applied this Luma range, say perhaps you don't want that, on the face, I can click on my erase brush, and again, I could erase just parts of the image. So I'm just erasing here like her face. And now what happens is I turn this on and off, it's being applied even less on the face than say the background. So you really are able to combine Luma range and the masking capabilities automatically, which is really, really handy. And finally, I also want to mention quite quickly, we have a color balance tool here in case you want to then color grade your midtone shadows and highlights separately too. Or you can just use the master tab and just move it that way, especially because we already have a perfect mask on this adjustment layer and it will apply only in the highlights. And so you can use the master tab and then move that around to get a specific look. Sometimes what I will also do is move this wheel around like this and look at the image and see exactly what strikes me as interesting, because sometimes I won't know till I play with it. And what I found out here is that kind of pushing it to like the green, a little bit cyan tones is making this image really come to life here. So you can see the before and after. really quickly. So that is really cool. Now, before I do anything else, I want to go ahead and see if there's any particular questions. I'm going to turn off my screen sharing for a second and address anything that I see really fast. And let's see what I can answer for you. Yes, Bella mentioned that using both PS and C1. Could you please say how we would use PS, since it looks like C1 does it all? Yes, then that's the next part, is going to be quick tips on how to use Photoshop now in combination with the processing. And even though Photoshop or CaptureOne does a lot and does have healing and cloning, it's a little bit slow, especially when it comes to doing a lot of adjustments. So I still recommend doing all the cleanup work in Photoshop, which I'm going to show you next. And that comes down to little details of blemish removal, cloning, and healing, and all of that. Don says, do you use a mouse or a drawing tablet? If you use a drawing tablet, which one do you recommend for both CaptureOne and Photoshop? I like to use a, I was going to say I use CaptureOne drawing tablet. I like to use a Wacom drawing tablet or Wacom, depending on what you call it. Nowadays, honestly, even the base model is quite good. I wouldn't recommend doing a lot of expense on it. You get a lot of used ones as well. They have a lot of names now, but initially it was called the Intuos and the Intuos Pro. Those are the two main lines. And now I believe they have Intuos Draw, I think it is called. Don't quote me on that. The only difference between them, honestly, is the Intuos Pro here has a pen that has a quite nice grip on this side. And the base model actually has a pen that's a little bit slimmer. But the constructions are all solid. I have never had one die out on me for 20 years. I know I'm jinxing myself when I say that, but I've been using my Intuos Pro for quite a while now. And I can show you here, even though it's a bit older. This is the Intuos 5, I believe, and a few years old now, but the new ones are quite nice. I think a small is perfect, honestly. My laptop, I'm using a small, and I wish I could use a smaller one than that, but I like using that one the most. Alan says, how did you display a before and after? I will show you right before I get into the Photoshop part, so don't worry, I will answer that for you and refresh your memory about that. Thank you so much. Let's see. Last question I'm going to quickly take, and I'll save some time at the end as well. Let's see. If you have any other questions, feel free to also message me on Instagram as well at the end if I can repeat anything for you, so don't feel pressure in case I don't get to it. But let's go back into a quick question. Vern says, will you doing any more styles for C1? I would say at the moment I'm not sure, but what you can also do is create your own styles in CaptureOne. And let me go ahead and show you a couple of things about that too. So thank you all so much for your questions, and let's keep on and going forward. Let's see, I'm going to enable my screen sharing again really quick. There we go, and I'll say hide. Now, when it comes to creating presets and things like that, there's a couple of other tabs here that I want to very quickly talk about. One is over here, like a little clipboard that says styles and presets. So perhaps you've made an adjustment that you want to save as a style or a preset. You come down here and you can say save user styles, or you can apply user styles or import them for anyone that wants to do that. It's kind of like your actions, so to speak, or your presets in Lightroom. And here you have a adjustment clipboard, so you can say copy all your adjustments, and then you can say paste it on something else. You can also use this top little icon here at the top right, which says copy and paste. So if I say copy over here, and I come down here and say paste, you can all automatically paste your adjustments from one to the other. And you'll notice that because over here, it also copied my layers, which is so cool and handy. I don't have to manually do them all again and again. I can also hold Shift and click on both of them to get a better view of both together. Sometimes I will do multiple versions and do that. And one thing that you also want to do is, let me just say okay for that for a second. And let me undo this one. I automatically double applied something. If you're trying to apply one image, the styles and information from one image to multiple, let's say I do this, and I want to apply to all of them. You want to make sure at the top here that it says edit selected. It has rectangle icons stacked on top of each other, you want to select that, because what happens is if you don't select that, it's only going to apply it to the actual image that you've selected. So even though I've held shift and selected multiple versions of them, it still has to have one image as a primary image. Then what happens is it's only going to apply it to that. So if I do not select that and I hit apply, it will only apply the functions to that image, even though I have multiple versions or multiple images selected. So keep this on always is my suggestion for you. Oh yes, and the before and after part. If I click on this before and after tab up top, and it's on the newer versions, on the CaptureOne 20, I believe, has it. And if you click on before and after, and this is the icon, this is the before and after icon. It might be a different location. If it is, you simply need to right click on the area and say customize toolbar, and then you will see the before and after here, which you can drag anywhere you want. You can even, you know, have it somewhere else too if you prefer to. So you can customize pretty much everything about this program, including keyboard shortcuts if you so choose to do that. I also got a question in the comments that said, can you make a specific ICC profile if you want to? I would recommend against that, because the profiles themselves are already quite good, and the way to make them manually is actually quite intensive. It's not straightforward. So I'm going to say yes and no in that question. I could find some resources for that for you, but because of the profiles already built in, you don't need to say do that again. You can still use a gray chart to get the white balance just right. I think that's pretty handy. So there's a bunch of different tools that we can do with this, but I also want to drop in some Photoshop knowledge as well. So let's go ahead and quickly export this into Photoshop, and I'll show you a couple of ways to do that. Number one is going to be over here on the process recipes section at the furthest right tab. It's called output. Now you don't have to do this, but I really love process recipes because I exported multiple varieties. Perhaps I want to export a full res TIFF file or PSD file, or a small TIFF file for WebRes. I could do multiple versions of that. And the way it works is actually pretty simple. It has a few process recipes already built in. One is TIFF Adobe RGB 1998, which is a color space that I pretty much use a lot of the time. I use TIFF files as my layers because you can go up to 4 GB if I want to, and it works just like PSD files do. So you can use whatever you want, but I'm just using that. And you can see here it says the recipe. So the recipe that we're going to use, it says format, TIFF file, 8-bit Adobe RGB, and it's pretty much as expected. The other cool part about process recipes is at the bottom here, it says open with. I can automatically just open it in Photoshop if I so choose to, and I can say process. And what's going to happen is once it's done processing, it's going to then open it up into Photoshop automatically. And another thing that I recommend is before you process, there's other tabs here called adjustments, files, etc. Now, file itself tells me where the image is going to be stored. Over here, if I click on, say, image folder, it's going to save in the same location as where your raw files are stored. And even cooler, you can make a subfolder. So I named mine working, and this one has a subfolder. So wherever the files are stored, there'll be a subfolder with the raw files. It'll say working, and my little TIFF files are all there to begin with. And the last one I want to talk about is the adjustments tab in the recipe section. And here you can decide whether you want the crop to be respected. So if I have a crop here, would you want to export it with the crop or without the crop? And also sharpening. I will disable all sharpening just because I actually want to make the skin retouching easy as possible. And sharpening is just a filter that you can add at any time. You don't need to add it in the raw processor. So disable that. Whatever your program using, just disable that, okay? I'm just gonna go into it because of time, and I could talk about this for hours. So again, check out the YouTube channel, and there's elaborate descriptions on every single thing on the CaptureOne page. Next, I'm going to go into Photoshop really quick. And really quickly, I want to tell you my little process here. So firstly, let me turn off everything that I have here. I don't really need all my little actions and things at the moment because I'm going to talk in really simple terms here. The first thing that I always do when it comes to skin or blemishes is I will typically add a blank layer here. And this blank layer is just the empty layer in Photoshop. Doesn't matter what version you're using. And then I will use the standard healing brush or the spot healing brush, depending on what's easier for you. But for me, I like using the healing brush just because of accuracy. And then finally, what I will do here at the top is I will use legacy, because that allows me to, I would say it works more efficiently than not using legacy. And I don't have time to get into the big differences at the moment, but I like using legacy for better accuracy for the results that the healing brush gives me. It takes a little bit longer sometimes, but the results are better for skin work. Then what I will do here is, as I zoom in, I will also make sure to sample current and below, because this is going to allow me to use this current blank layer and sample everything below it. So I don't have to duplicate the background. That's very important to me. Now I will use Option and quickly just remove some of these blemishes here. I'll spend maybe a minute or so doing just the main blemishes. And I always think, authenticity is very important. So for this example here, and I want to keep all the skin texture, is I'm going to simply remove the main blemishes that I find very distracting. I'm going to zoom out here really quickly because I want to keep the main blemishes in focus. I don't want to zoom in too much. I know I only have a few minutes left, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to focus on the most important blemishes, because otherwise you could be here for a while and you're going to be able to see how even just a few minutes can make a huge difference if you focus on the main blemishes. And this is why I encourage people to work zoomed out. Always work whenever you have the face kind of in the center of the frame like this, so you keep things in perspective, especially when you're not used to, I guess, retouching so much detail. Then you're able to zoom in here and kind of fix what you're looking for. You don't have to zoom in too much. I think that's very, very important. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. You even have some of the blemishes here on the eye too. It's not really blemishes as much as it is the makeup kind of applying very heavily to the eyebrows, or to the eyelids, I should say, or the area between the eyebrows and the eyelids. The no man's land of eyes, I guess. I don't know. So there we go. Just a quick couple of things here. So I'm holding Option and Alt and sampling close to the blemish as possible, and I'm kind of just brushing that out here. My settings, if you want to know, are going to be hardness at 0% and size at 15 pixels. That changes the size, but the hardness is the most important. Also next is going to be, I might even sample the hair to remove the blemishes that are in the eyebrow itself. You can see here that it did a pretty good job. And just like that. Let's quickly turn this layer on and off. You can see here in a couple of strokes, the skin looks quite flat and nice and pleasing. So I think that's fairly important. Now, some people ask me, what about frequency separation? Well, you can use that as well, or dodge and burn, in order to kind of even out the skin here. I don't have time to get in the intricacies of that part, but what I will mention is that if you are looking to learn more retouching, I also have a retouching education platform called the Retouching series. And there it has a full, in-depth, very slow and precise kind of workflow explanation on the retouching process. But my main steps to kind of encompass everything is I will heal here like this. I will also have a dodge and burn action that I run here. And all it is two different adjustment layers. And you'll see here, one adjustment layer is a curve going up, and the other adjustment layer is a curve going down. And they both have these black masks attached to them. And then what I could do is, if I click on this dodge here, and I switch over to my regular brush tool, I then can change my flow to something like 2%. And as I zoom out here, I can easily just brush in any area that I want to lighten. And I can control how dark or light any specific areas are by changing my brush size and using a low flow. So things like under eyes, I think, are good to kind of lighten up just a little bit. Anything that catches the light negatively, I kind of want to lighten up. And you can see if I turn that on and off, you can see it improves that area a little bit after that. And then the process from there is I will typically use a blank layer set to color and kind of play around with the colors from there and do my color grading at the end, because I want to keep things very non-destructive, if that makes sense. Everything else is all subjective. For example, if you want to use the clone brush for something, so for instance, maybe you want to, the healing brush is not working like on an edge of a line, or if you're too close to the eyeliner here, I can switch over to my clone brush, do the same thing, current and below. I'll use a slower flow, maybe 3% flow here, 100% opacity. My brush size is relatively the same, and then I could just come in here with my clone brush, holding Option or Alt to sample, and just quickly, even that out here like that. I think that looks really cool. And I think having a low flow on your brush tool, your clone brush, is very, very important. And just like that, I can kind of control what's happening. Again, healing brush is anything on the skin, something that's easy to remove. When the healing brush doesn't work, then you want to jump over to your clone brush in order to take care of that. So that's kind of what I wanted to give you a brief example on, in the possibilities of using CaptureOne and Photoshop together. And we could spend 8 hours on Photoshop alone today, but I hope that gives you just a really nice, quick and clean workflow. As you can see here, I've done a few different steps, but the results look so good already that if I posted this on Instagram, people would be happy. And honestly, it keeps the joy in photography, allows you to keep creating. So I think that is it for me. Let me go back to the questions here and turn off my screen sharing for a second. And let's see if anybody has any quick questions on that as well. Let's see. We got one that says, can you share some tips on what photographers should be aware of when they're retouching photos? So the thing is that when you're retouching photos, you always want to be aware of distractions. And this can be explained in a variety of different ways. For me, distractions are skin blemishes, or it's flyaways, anything that catches your eye. That is why there's no rule about it, because everybody considers distractions differently. If you ask a photojournalist, there might be no distractions in a photograph. So sometimes it's all about, of course, how you want to process a photo, but also what you prefer removing. For me, as I mentioned, if there's nothing that is too distracting, I won't go looking for them. The second you go looking for something, that's when you get in the realm of over-processing an image. So for me, it's blemishes, any texture areas that are too rich sometimes on the skin that might not look flattering. So I might use a clone brush at a low flow and kind of even that out a bit, or some frequency separation too. But that is primarily kind of what my ethos is. I usually heal and clone, then dodge and burn, and do a little bit of color work, sometimes frequency separation, but I like to keep it very simple. And that's how I've kind of built my style over that, regardless of whatever you see. And the medium also dictates what a distraction is. Maybe a landscape photo might have something different, where it might be a little tree that wasn't supposed to be there, or the shade of color of that grass wasn't the way it should be. So that's kind of how I look at a photograph, is really listen to yourself, spend some time practicing. You're not going to read about it immediately and learn it. It's going to be a very long process of practice and personal experience. So thank you so much for that question. Let's see here if I have another really great one. It says, how do you get the images edited in Photoshop into CaptureOne? Do you have to import it, or is there a way to make a round trip from C1 to PS without having to import the images? So basically what happens is that if you want the image in the same catalog, so to speak, and to kind of, read it, whenever you export, you can also, say just not have it in a working subfolder, and that will sometimes just automatically bring it back. Another really great way is if you right click on this image and you say edit, edit with Photoshop, it will export that file into the same location and also put it back into your catalog. So then you can see the file in here as well. I would recommend TIFF files, so it's easily readable through CaptureOne. So you can see the edited file as well as your raw file there side by side. It's very, very important. So thank you so much for that quick question. Let's see. Oh, and because I wasn't sharing my screen, I forgot to tell you that, is when you right click on an image and edit with Photoshop, it'll just be a menu option that says edit with, and you can go straight into Photoshop that way, and it will have the images placed back into your catalog there. Let's see. Thank you, Marek. Yes, PSD is a type of file that is specific to just Photoshop, and that's why TIFF files are great because they're readable through different areas of the post-processing realm, so to speak. So if you're trying to like look at a file in your browser or another application, TIFF files are very easily readable, so you can probably use that much easier. But the main difference is that the TIFF files have a 4 GB limit, but the PSDs have 2. So although that's not a huge deal, if you're working with let's say a really large megapixel file, you might do a few layers and you run into a 2 GB limit, then you have to resave it again as something else, and that's just a big pain in the butt. So I just like using TIFF files because most of my files will never get to the 4 GB mark. There's really no difference quality-wise, and I think that's very, very important. Let's see. These are really fantastic questions. I'm glad I was able to answer most of them. Let me see, does Bella shoot for you knowing that you are capable of, or for example, different exposure plates? Stephen asked that question, and I would say that before any big shoot, I actually ask her whether or not she needs to shoot anything specific. So maybe a job requires a ballerina shot outside. And we did have this happen where we photographed the ballerina with some smoke or fog. And I knew that they were going to want to actually expand the frame of the photograph vertically and horizontally for different usages. So whether it's social media or backgrounds or billboards and all kinds of fun stuff. So what I told her was that aside from shooting the ballerinas, make sure you get some photographs of just the backgrounds by itself without them, and just the fog by itself without the ballerinas as well. So she shot the fog with the background together. Then she also shot the ballerinas. And of course, she shot everything together too. The main shot that was selected was with everything together. But because she shot the background images by itself without any disruptions, I had really clean areas to clone from. So if you're shooting outside and you have that issue often where you don't know how to remove something in a complex scenario, well, you can actually take blank plates like that. We call them plates, and they basically just mean empty files that you can source from in order to composites. Sometimes we might even composite different faces from one face of one image that we liked to a main area too. So we actually have that discussion beforehand so that she can take it accordingly. The same thing goes for exposure. If we find that we're using a really high contrast situation, we might take different exposures, but usually we underexpose a little bit more than overexpose, and that takes care of it, and we don't really need to do too much. She shoots on a phase 1 camera as well as a Canon camera, so depending on what's possible. The phase 1 she'll use on really big jobs because the dynamic range is there as well. The color's a little bit different too, and that's kind of what we do. If you've never used medium format before, I would rent one for, like, if you have a big job or something, which most clients do. What happens is they will rent the camera for the job specifically in order for them to get the best quality without actually buying the camera. So that's a really cool way to do it if you've ever been very curious, is to rent one for a job, play with it for a day with your personal project maybe, and then you can get it paid for to shoot. So that's really fun to do. Thank you so much, Melissa. I'm really glad that has helped you. And thank you, Stephen, for answering that great question. And then I also said, I think that's pretty much it. I would love to connect with you all after this segment. So if there's anything that I can assist you with, just let me know on Instagram. And I think that would be it from me for now. If you have any other questions, please do leave them in the comments. But aside from that, as I mentioned, Photoshop is something that I've been doing for such a long time. It's my passion, but it's also my life and my hobby as well. I still use it and learn about it, especially with Adobe Max, with all the things coming out in the future. So it's going to be very interesting to see for what happens down the line, what kind of creative tools that happen. And Photoshop is in a very interesting spot right now because they're using artificial intelligence to come out with amazing things that are possible for us creatives. But it's going to be interesting to see the moral dilemma that happens because of these opportunities in photography and the discussions that we'll continue to have with just retouching alone, but now with artificial intelligence and how that can change the realism of a photograph. So we're always living in this world between the realism and the post-processing side, and whether that's digital art or is that photography, that's going to be an evolving, continual discussion. But retouching has been around for so many years that even in the film days, they would cut and splice different shots to merge and photo composite some different images as a whole. Pablo says, what are your thoughts on the FS 2.0 for cleaning up blemishes? I would say that so for those of you who do not know, frequency separation, there's multiple versions of it. The only difference between the most recent version is that they use a form of blurring called median. And median is basically a form of blurring where it keeps all the lines of the subject intact, the outline of it. So it allows for better frequency separation. I think that it works really well. Just be careful of not overusing it, of course, because like anything else, overusing it can really complicate things. And then finally, I would recommend not doing that only. Like I would love to get people to try dodge and burn if you haven't before, as I've mentioned, because what it could do is it evens out transitions nicely so that you don't have to use frequency separation as much. So that's actually really, really important. So thank you so much, Pablo. Again, play with different techniques, but combine them sometimes, see and experiment, because a video can take you to different places, but when you apply them to your own images, you might find that it doesn't work as you thought it was going to work, or you might find that you might prefer another technique better, or you might want to combine techniques. So, use that explorative mindset to do both. And I still do that. I still look at new techniques and different techniques and see where it fits into the whole program. But it turns out that for the most part, I tend to stick with a really clean and simplistic approach instead of going too far. Because you will notice that if you do too much frequency separation, you get a very interesting effect where you see too much texture and not enough variety in the tone of the skin. Because skin tone has undertones, it has surface level colors, it has different level of texture. So you want to be careful not to even out things too much. But for product photos, they actually do quite well. So I think that's a very good point that you mentioned. And finally, I think we have one more question from Brandon, who says, do you edit differently if the photo is going for print? Now, for print itself, the only thing that I will do a little bit differently is I will actually sharpen a lot more at the end. Normally, I don't sharpen actually that much at all. I might sharpen key areas like the eyes. I primarily like using the unsharp mask function in Photoshop, and that's under the filter sharpen area. But the reason I don't sharpen too much is because you do all this work on the skin, and if you try to sharpen skin, what sometimes happens is it kind of overpronounces the texture again, and so you end up actually, it doesn't look as good. So I like to sharpen only then when it's for print. So that's kind of what my workflow is there, is eyes for smaller things that are not going for print and details, but then when it's going for print, I might over sharpen to compensate for the loss of quality when you're running it through.
Hello, how are you doing there, Patrick?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, fantastic. What a great presentation you gave us. Thank you so much for going into such detail. I want to just emphasize for everybody listening, CaptureOne, you can get a trial version of it. It's a phenomenal way to learn any program. Make sure that the day that you download it, you use every single one of those 30 days to trial and practice with it while you've got it for free.
Yeah.
I know from experience that once you try it, you probably won't go back. And after watching everything you've showed us, I think people will enjoy it tremendously. Thank you so much. What I'd like to be able to do, if we may, I just want to, our photo contest, The Essence of the Pandemic in Hawaii, has a winner. And you've picked a great image, and I'd like you just to see, here it is. And it's Lance Wong. Lance, if you're out there, well done. Beautiful black and white. Your thoughts?
When I actually had a chance to go through all the photos, I was pretty impressed, because we took the concept of the current situation and going out there to kind of encapsulate that. Everyone had such a unique view, and it really got me thinking that we're really living in a strange time. Like, we're doing this conference here online right now, and the images that I saw were so dystopian that I didn't think that they were real. I was like, I couldn't believe it. Like, there was one image, with a baby and a mother with the mask, and you could see the background. There was like a homeless person, and it was this whole duality of things happening. But the reason why I picked this photo in specific, because it actually brought out a lot of emotion in me. It made me stop to think that right now, a lot of us are, of course, many of us are struggling, and we're using these things to advance and inspire us to think about what else we could learn, what else we could do for the future. But this image brought me back to the present, making me realize that many businesses, like with seafood or going to the markets, they don't have the luxury sometimes of learning other traits and things because they're really busy trying to hold on to their current situation in business. And it reflected on small business, it reflected on the consumer, how integrated we are to consuming and also selling. And this little market here made me feel all of that by looking at him over the counter and being in that situation. And for him or her or they felt pretty normal, because it felt like a part of normal life now. But seeing that empty space, seeing the boxes of stock there, of potential things that could be selling, visions of the past where perhaps they would have had a full space there, trying to imagine what would have been last year or maybe a year from now, is so wild to me. And it just really felt really rich. It was a good conversion. Even the black and white conversion was fantastic. You had the central area in the middle where the exposure was perfect. As you go outwards, it becomes more dull. And then in the middle, you have this stark silhouette of a person surrounded by the light, and everything just led you there and made you think. So for me, I think that was my favorite photograph.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much. So Brandon, you'll have your own copy of CaptureOne, version 20, which is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Patrick, we thank you very much. You are an awesome information guide for us. And I hope that people who don't have CaptureOne realize that what it does is it expands our creativity by having the right tools and then learning how we can use it. And the wonderful thing is, as we've seen today, is you can learn it at your own pace, and you can trial it out and see what you can do and adjust your images and enjoy it. So folks, for those of you, if you haven't registered for our next couple of classes today, we have Stan Moniz from Sony coming up, which is going to be very exciting. And we've got an action-packed day. And then tomorrow we've got a massive day starting again at 8 o'clock. You can register for any one of those classes still. Just go online, register, and join us. So thank you so much. Thank you, CaptureOne. Thank you, Phase One. Pratik, you are an awesome guy, and we enjoyed having you with us. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so appreciative of everyone who learned a lot. I'm so sorry that, I want to talk for hours. Obviously, you can't, but I hope this inspired you and got you going.
We'll do that next year.
Yes, exactly. Let's do it in person, and it will be a lot of fun.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much. Over now. Thank you.
Bye.